The fluorescent lights of Johnson's supermarket cast harsh shadows across the produce section as Senator Elijah Carter examined an avocado, his mind elsewhere. His wife Michelle stood beside him, her shopping basket half full, her expression concerned. "You can't keep avoiding this speech, Elijah," Michelle said, keeping her voice low. "The community needs to hear your stance on police reform." She placed a hand on his arm, but he continued staring at the avocado. "It's not that simple," Elijah replied, finally setting the fruit down. At 53, he carried himself with the practiced dignity of a career politician, but today his shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of his responsibilities. "One wrong word, and the conservatives will paint me as an extremist. One soft statement, and our people will see me as a sellout." Michelle shook her head. "Since when did you start caring more about political consequences than doing what's right?" Before Elijah could respond, two police officers entered the store. Officer James Wilson and Officer Robert Hayes, both white men in their 30s, made their way down the main aisle. Wilson nudged Hayes with his elbow. "Look who we got here," Wilson muttered, just loud enough for Hayes to hear. "Senator Carter himself, shopping with the common folk." Hayes snorted. "Yeah, probably trying to look relatable for his next campaign video." His hand rested casually on his belt as they watched Carter from a distance. Michelle noticed the officer's presence and instinctively moved closer to her husband. "Elijah, maybe we should finish up." "We're not doing anything wrong," Elijah responded, though his body tensed slightly. He'd spent his entire career navigating spaces like this, knowing that despite his position, his skin color made him a target. The officers began moving closer, pretending to patrol the aisles but clearly focused on the senator. Other shoppers noticed the growing tension, some slowing their pace to watch the scene unfold. "Sir, could you step away from the produce?" Officer Wilson called out, his voice carrying an edge of authority that seemed unnecessary for the situation. Elijah turned slowly, maintaining his composure. "Is there a problem, officers?" "We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area," Hayes said, though no such reports existed. "We're going to need to see some identification." Michelle stepped forward. "This is Senator Elijah Carter. Surely you recognize him." "Ma'am, please step back," Wilson commanded, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "Sir, remove your hands from your pockets slowly." Elijah's hands were clearly visible, holding nothing but the shopping list Michelle had written. "Officers, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm simply grocery shopping with my wife." The situation escalated as more shoppers gathered, some pulling out their phones to record. The officers moved closer, their stance aggressive despite the complete lack of threat. "Last warning," Hayes barked. "Show us your ID now, or we'll have to take you in for questioning." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Elijah, a United States senator being harassed while buying groceries. But he knew any wrong move could turn this into something far worse. This was exactly the kind of incident he'd been planning to address in his upcoming speech, and now here he was, living it in real time. The situation exploded in seconds. Officer Wilson lunged forward, grabbing Elijah's arm as the senator reached for his wallet. In one violent motion, he slammed the elected official against the produce display, sending apples rolling across the floor. "Stop resisting!" Hayes shouted, though Elijah wasn't fighting back. The senator's face pressed against the cold metal rack, his suit jacket riding up as Wilson roughly yanked his arms behind his back. Phones recorded from every angle as the officers forced Elijah to the ground. A young mother pulled her children away, covering their eyes. An elderly man shouted, "That's Senator Carter, you idiots," but the officers ignored him. Michelle's scream cut through the chaos. She'd gone to get more produce when the confrontation started, and now returned to find her husband face down on the dirty supermarket floor, a knee pressed into his back. "Get off him!" Michelle rushed forward, her shopping basket clattering to the floor. "He's a United States senator. What are you doing?" "Ma'am, stay back or you'll be arrested too," Wilson threatened, tightening his grip on Elijah's wrists as he applied the handcuffs. The fluorescent lights caught the silver of the handcuffs, the scene reflected in the produce mirrors above. Dozens of phones captured every moment, the respected Senator Carter, in his tailored suit, being treated like a common criminal. Michelle pulled out her phone with shaking hands, already dialing their lawyer. Her voice trembled but carried strength as she recorded the officers' badge numbers, names, and every detail of the scene. "This is going straight to the media," she announced loudly. "And to the police commissioner. I want every person here as a witness." The store manager finally emerged from his office, pale-faced and uncertain. "Officers, there must be some mistake. That's Senator Carter." "We're responding to suspicious behavior," Hayes cut him off. This man matched a description. A college student near the front spoke up, her phone steady as she recorded. The only description he matched was being black in your supermarket. The video was already uploading to social media, spreading like wildfire across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Hashtag Senator Carter and hashtag shopping while black began trending within minutes. Elijah remained silent throughout the ordeal, years of political training kicking in. He knew every word, every movement would be scrutinized. Still, the humiliation burned through his practiced composure. Decades of public service, law degrees, and a seat in the Senate meant nothing in the face of systemic racism. As the officers began to drag him toward the exit, whispers and angry murmurs followed. Shoppers pulled out phones, taking photos, recording videos, sending texts. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. Michelle followed close behind, her lawyer on speakerphone, documenting every moment. Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady as she narrated the events for the legal record. "My husband, Senator Elijah Carter, is being wrongfully detained while shopping for groceries. The officers provided no cause, no warning, and used excessive force. I want this on record." The automatic doors slid open, and the officers paraded Elijah through the parking lot toward their patrol car, past shocked onlookers and running news crews who had already begun to arrive. Sarah Jenkins sat in her cramped studio apartment, her laptop's blue light illuminating her face as she watched the video for the 5th time. At 28, she'd seen countless viral videos of police brutality, but this one hit differently. The sight of Senator Carter, a man she'd voted for, being treated like a criminal made her stomach turn. "Not this time," she muttered, closing her laptop with determination. As the founder of Justice Now NYC, a grassroots organization with growing influence, Sarah had spent years trying to move people from social media outrage to actual action. This incident could be the catalyst she'd been waiting for. She pulled out her phone and started making calls. First to community leaders, then to local businesses, and finally to her network of activists. Within hours, she'd secured the community center on 125th Street for an emergency meeting. "We need everyone there," she told Marcus, her co-organizer. "Not just the usual faces. This isn't about politics anymore, this is about basic human dignity." The community center filled quickly that evening. People spilled out onto the sidewalk, teachers, students, business owners, clergy members. The air buzzed with anger and purpose. Sarah stood at the podium, her natural confidence amplified by urgency. "We've all seen the video," she began, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "Senator Carter was humiliated today not because of anything he did, but because of who he is. And if they can do this to a United States senator, imagine what happens to those without power, without cameras, without influence." The crowd murmured in agreement. An elderly woman stood up, her voice shaking. "My grandson was stopped 3 times last month just walking to school. 3 times. More stories poured out, each person carrying their own weight of injustice, their own memories of fear and humiliation. Sarah listened, documented, and began forming a plan. Then the room fell silent. Senator Carter himself stood in the doorway, still wearing the same suit from the incident, though now wrinkled from his detention. His wife Michelle stood beside him, her hand gripped tightly in his. Sarah gestured for him to take the podium. The senator walked slowly, deliberately, every eye in the room following him. When he reached the microphone, he paused, looking out at the faces before him. "Today," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I was reminded that no title, no office, no achievement can protect us from the cancer of racism. I've spent years trying to work within the system, to change things gradually. But today, when those officers threw me to the ground, they didn't see a senator. They saw what they wanted to see." The room was absolutely still. Someone sniffled in the back. A young man wiped his eyes. "I've been asked to give a speech about police reform next week," Elijah continued. "Well, this is my speech. This is our reality. And if my humiliation can serve as a catalyst for real change, then perhaps it was worth it." Sarah watched from the side, seeing the room transform from a gathering of angry individuals into a unified force. This wasn't just another viral moment, this was the beginning of something bigger. Senator Carter's social media accounts, usually filled with formal policy announcements and diplomatic statements, transformed overnight. His first post after the incident, a simple photo of his bruised wrists with the caption, "Shopping while black in 2024, garnered millions of shares within hours." Sarah helped manage the messaging, teaching the senator's team about effective hashtag usage and timing. His following doubled, then tripled. Every post became a rallying cry for justice, each one amplifying Sarah's grassroots movement. "Sir, we need to discuss this direction you're taking," Richard Monroe, Elijah's senior advisor, said during an emergency staff meeting. The campaign office buzzed with nervous energy as staff members watched their carefully crafted political strategy unravel. "Your approval ratings among moderate whites are dropping," Amanda Chen, his polling expert, added, sliding a report across the desk. "We're looking at a potential 15-point swing in the wrong direction." Elijah stood at his office window, looking out at the city skyline. His reflection showed the fading bruise near his temple where he'd hit the produce rack. "And what about approval ratings in our community? Among young voters? Among anyone who's ever been profiled or harassed? Those numbers are up," Amanda admitted reluctantly. "But sir, you can't win re-election with just those demographics. We need to think about the bigger picture." "The bigger picture?" Elijah turned, his voice sharp. "I was handcuffed and humiliated in front of children for buying groceries. That is the bigger picture." Richard stepped forward, his expression pained. "Senator, no one disputes that what happened was wrong. But you're a politician, not an activist. Let others fight this battle. You need to focus on legislation, on working within the system." "The system?" Elijah laughed bitterly. "The same system that let those officers walk away with paid leave while I sat in a holding cell. The same system that's been investigating police brutality for decades while nothing changes." His phone buzzed, another notification from the Justice Now NYC group. Sarah had organized another rally, bigger than the last. The support was growing, not just in New York but across the country. "If you continue down this path," Richard warned, "you'll lose donors. Major corporate backing. Support from law enforcement unions." Elijah picked up the polling report, studied it for a moment, then deliberately dropped it into his trash bin. "Maybe it's time we stopped worrying about who will lose and started thinking about who will gain." His staff watched in stunned silence as he opened Twitter and began typing, "To those asking me to stay quiet and work within the system, I've tried that. Now it's time for the system to work for us. Join me and at Justice Now NYC tomorrow at 2 p.m. Enough is enough." The tweet went viral before his staff could object. Minutes later, Sarah retweeted it with a simple addition, "This is what leadership looks like. See you tomorrow, Senator." The march stretched for blocks, transforming Fifth Avenue into a river of humanity. Sarah and Elijah walked at the front, their unlikely partnership a symbol of the movement's growing strength. Behind them, thousands carried signs, their messages ranging from personal pain to collective demand: "Justice for all, stop police brutality, your badge isn't a license to kill." "We've got people from every borough," Sarah reported, checking her phone as they walked. "And solidarity marches starting in Chicago, LA, and Atlanta." She'd spent weeks coordinating with other activists, ensuring the message remained focused and peaceful. Elijah nodded, noting the diversity of the crowd. Elderly women in church hats walked alongside teenagers in hoodies. Wall Street executives marched next to retail workers. White mothers pushed strollers beside black fathers carrying children on their shoulders. "This is what they fear," he said quietly to Sarah. "Not the violence they claim will bring, but this unity. This power." Michelle walked on Elijah's other side, live-streaming the march to his social media followers. The numbers kept climbing, 50,000 viewers, then 100,000, then more. But trouble was brewing ahead. A group of counter-protesters had gathered near Columbus Circle, their faces twisted with anger. They carried thin blue-line flags and signs supporting the police officers who'd arrested Elijah. "Senator," one of Elijah's security team warned, "maybe we should reroute." Before anyone could respond, the counter-protesters began chanting, "Back the blue! Back the blue!" Some pushed against the barricades separating the groups. Sarah grabbed her megaphone, "Stay calm, Stay focused. We're not here for confrontation. The police presence intensified. Officers in riot gear appeared at intersections, their stance aggressive despite the march's peaceful nature. The sight of their uniforms sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. One officer stared directly at Elijah, his hand resting pointedly on his weapon. The senator recognized him, Officer Wilson's partner from the supermarket incident. "Keep moving," Sarah urged, seeing the recognition in Elijah's eyes. "Don't give them what they want." But the counter-protesters grew bolder. Someone threw a water bottle. Then another. The police moved in, but instead of controlling the counter-protesters, they faced the marchers, shields up. "This is a peaceful protest," Elijah called out, his voice carrying over the growing chaos. "We have a permit. We have rights." The tension reached a breaking point as more objects flew through the air. Police began pushing forward with their shields, breaking up the front lines of marchers. Sarah's voice crackled through the megaphone, "Everyone sit down. Show them we're not the violent ones. Sit down." Like a wave, the protesters began sitting, thousands of people lowering themselves to the asphalt in unified defiance. The image was powerful, peaceful protesters seated before advancing riot police, their hands raised in surrender even as they refused to surrender their cause. The standoff at Columbus Circle intensified. Officer Hayes pushed through the line of riot police, pointing directly at Senator Carter. "Get your people out of here, Senator, or we'll remove them." Elijah stepped forward, hands raised. "These are American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. Stand down, Officer Hayes. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" Hayes sneered, loud enough for nearby cameras to pick up. "You mean like playing victim in that supermarket? Using your position to stir up trouble?" The seated protesters remained still, phones recording everything. Sarah stood beside Elijah, her megaphone lowered but ready. The tension crackled like electricity before a storm. "That's what you think happened?" Elijah's voice carried across the square. "That I orchestrated my own humiliation? That I chose to be thrown to the ground in front of my wife?" Hayes stepped closer, his face inches from Elijah's. "You people always make everything about race. Maybe if you followed orders dash." "Orders?" Elijah's composure cracked slightly. "I was buying groceries. My crime was existing in a space you decided I didn't belong. Just like right now." The crowd watched the confrontation in tense silence. Michelle's hand gripped Sarah's arm, both women ready to intervene if needed. "You're endangering public safety," Hayes continued, gesturing at the peaceful protesters. "This little show of yours is disrupting the entire city." "No, Officer Hayes," Elijah's voice grew stronger. "What endangers public safety is armed officers who see threats in shopping carts and peaceful assemblies. Who see criminals instead of senators, thugs instead of citizens." A young black man in the front row stood up suddenly, making Hayes and several other officers reach for their weapons. "Don't touch him," the young man shouted. "We see you." The police surged forward. In the chaos, the young man was knocked down, his head hitting the pavement with a sickening crack. Blood began pooling beneath him. "Medic!" Sarah screamed into her megaphone. "We need a medic." Elijah dropped to his knees beside the fallen protester, using his suit jacket to cushion the young man's head. Hayes stood over them, his expression a mix of concern and defensiveness. "This is what happens," Elijah said, looking up at the officer, his voice heavy with controlled rage. "This is what we're fighting against." Another young black man bleeding because someone with a badge felt threatened by his very existence. Cameras captured everything, the injured protester, the senator's bloodied suit jacket, Officer Hayes' face as the reality of the situation sank in. Within minutes, the footage was spreading across social media, adding fuel to an already blazing movement. The young man's name was Marcus Thompson, a 19-year-old college student. His injury became a rallying point, transforming the movement from a response to one incident into something much larger. Within days, donations flooded in from across the country, enough to cover not just Marcus's medical bills, but to launch something more substantial. "We need to make this count," Sarah told Elijah in his office, surrounded by stacks of letters and printouts of donation receipts. "People aren't just sending money, they're sending their stories, their pain, their hope." Elijah nodded, reading through another letter. A mother in Detroit, her son was beaten during a traffic stop. No charges filed. The officer's still on duty. That's why we're creating the Justice Fund, Sarah explained, pulling up a presentation on her laptop. Legal aid for victims of police brutality. Support for families. Resources for reform advocacy. Michelle entered with coffee and more mail. The donations just passed $2 million, she announced. And Marcus is being released from the hospital tomorrow. Meanwhile, across town at the police department, an internal affairs investigation was underway. Officers Wilson and Hayes sat in separate rooms, facing questions about both the supermarket incident and the protest confrontation. Officer Hayes, the investigator, read from his notes, "You claimed Senator Carter was acting suspiciously in the supermarket. Can you elaborate?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "It's all in my report." "Yes, your report. Which contradicts 17 witness statements and multiple video recordings." The investigator leaned forward. "Your superior officer wants this handled quietly. Paid suspension, mandatory training, back on duty in a few weeks." In another room, Wilson received the same message: "Stay quiet, take the suspension, wait it out." The system protecting its own, as it always had. But this time was different. Sarah had organized teams to track every step of the investigation. Whistleblowers within the department leaked documents. Journalists followed paper trails. The wall of silence began cracking. Elijah and Sarah worked late into the night, transforming the Justice Fund from concept to reality. They created a board of directors, established transparent funding protocols, and built partnerships with civil rights attorneys across the country. "This isn't just about punishment," Elijah explained to a room full of supporters. "It's about prevention. It's about creating real consequences and real change." Marcus Thompson attended the fund's launch event, his head still bandaged but his spirit unbroken. "Senator Carter and Ms. Jenkins didn't just help me," he told the crowd. "They're making sure what happened to me means something. That it leads to real change." The fund's first action was to file a class action lawsuit against the department, representing not just Marcus and Elijah, but dozens of others who'd faced similar treatment. The blue wall of silence began to show its first real cracks. The television studio buzzed with pre-show tension. Face the Nation had scored the biggest political interview of the year, Senator Elijah Carter and Officer James Hayes, face-to-face, with veteran journalist Diana Reynolds moderating. In the green room, Sarah helped Elijah prepare. "Remember, this isn't about you versus Hayes. It's about the system. Stay focused on the bigger picture. They're trying to turn this into entertainment," Michelle added, adjusting her husband's tie. "Don't let them." On the other side of the studio, Hayes sat alone, reviewing prepared statements from the police union. His hands shook slightly as he read. The show began with footage from both incidents, the supermarket arrest and the protest confrontation. Diana Reynolds turned to Elijah first. "Senator Carter, you've called this a watershed moment. Why?" "Because it exposed a truth we can no longer ignore," Elijah responded, his voice steady. "When those officers threw me to the ground, they didn't see a senator. They saw what generations of systemic racism taught them to see, a threat. And that split-second judgment, that ingrained bias, it's killing our people." Hayes shifted in his chair. "Senator, with all due respect, you're painting law enforcement with a very broad brush. We make split-second decisions to protect Dash." "Protect who?" Elijah interrupted, pulling out a stack of papers. "I have data from your own department. Last year, black citizens were 7 times more likely to be stopped, searched, and detained than white citizens. In identical situations, officers used force against black suspects at a rate of dash. Statistics can be manipulated," Hayes cut in. "You're not on the streets. You don't know what we face." "Actually, Officer Hayes, I do know." Elijah's voice remained calm but forceful. "I've faced it my entire life. The difference is, when you feel threatened, you can draw a weapon. When we feel threatened by you, we can't even reach for our wallet without risking our lives." Diana turned to Hayes. "Officer, how do you respond to the video evidence showing no suspicious behavior before the arrest?" Hayes's rehearsed answers crumbled under the weight of reality. The camera caught his hesitation, his struggle to justify actions that looked increasingly indefensible. "We're trained." he began, then stopped. The studio lights felt hot. The silence stretched. We're trained to identify threats, but maybe sometimes we see threats that aren't there. It was the closest thing to an admission they'd heard from any officer involved. Elijah leaned forward, speaking not just to Hayes but to the millions watching. That's exactly the problem. And until we acknowledge it, until we change not just policies but perspectives, nothing will change. More Marcus Thompsons will bleed on our streets. More parents will fear for their children. More Americans will live as second-class citizens in their own country. The audience in the studio sat in stunned silence. Even Diana Reynolds, known for her tough questioning, seemed moved by the exchange. A crack in the blue wall began as a whisper, then grew into a roar. Following the televised debate, a group of younger officers, led by Officer Maria Rodriguez, approached their union with concerns about systemic racism within the force. "We're not all like Hayes and Wilson," Rodriguez told reporters outside the precinct. "Some of us actually want to protect and serve everyone, not just some people." Meanwhile, Sarah dove deep into Hayes's personnel file, obtained through a network of department whistleblowers. Late one night, she called Elijah with her discovery. "Senator, Hayes has a pattern," she said, her voice urgent. "Before your incident, there were 6 similar complaints. All buried. All involving black men. But here's the kicker, he worked in Atlanta 5 years ago. There was an incident, a fatal one." Elijah sat up in his home office, Michelle listening beside him on speakerphone. "Tell me." "A black teenager, James Robinson. Killed during what Hayes claimed was a routine traffic stop. The dashcam footage disappeared. The case was closed. The family was paid to keep quiet." Sarah's voice trembled with controlled anger. "He wasn't disciplined. He was transferred. To our precinct." Elijah and Michelle exchanged looks. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a system that recycled problematic officers, hiding their misconduct behind transfers and sealed records. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Wilson and Hayes weren't randomly partnered. They specifically requested to work together. Their texts, which I just received from an anonymous source, show they targeted specific neighborhoods, specific demographics. The evidence mounted." Sarah and her team worked through the night, compiling a comprehensive report. It wasn't just about individual officers anymore, it was about department policies, union protections, and a culture of silence that enabled abuse. "We need to be careful how we release this," Michelle cautioned. "The department will try to discredit us, claim we're attacking the police." "No," Elijah said firmly. "We're attacking corruption. We're attacking abuse of power. Any good officer should stand with us on this." They decided to release the report through multiple channels simultaneously, mainstream media, social media, and directly to oversight committees. But first, Elijah made one crucial call. "Officer Rodriguez," he said when she answered. "We're about to release evidence of systemic misconduct in your department. I'm calling because officers like you, who want real change, shouldn't be caught in the crossfire." Rodriguez's response was immediate. "Tell me how I can help, Senator. There are more of us than you think." The stage was set for the biggest police accountability story in New York's recent history. Hayes's past was about to catch up with him, and with it, the entire system that had protected him would be exposed. The report hit like a bombshell. Hayes's past in Atlanta made national headlines. The Robinson family came forward, breaking their silence after 5 years. James Robinson's mother stood beside Senator Carter at a press conference, her presence more powerful than any words. "My son couldn't be saved," she said, gripping the podium. "But maybe we can save someone else's child." The police commissioner had no choice but to act. Hayes was suspended pending investigation, along with 3 superior officers who had helped bury the previous complaints. Wilson, faced with evidence of his text messages, resigned before he could be terminated. Officer Rodriguez and her group of reform-minded officers became the face of positive change within the department. They worked with Sarah to develop new training protocols and community engagement programs. In the community center where it all began, Elijah stood before a packed room. Marcus Thompson sat in the front row, fully recovered, now working as the Justice Fund's youth coordinator. Sarah stood to the side, watching the movement they built together. Today, We achieved something important, Elijah began. But let me be clear, this isn't a happy ending. This is a beginning. Hayes's firing won't end police brutality. One department's reforms won't fix systemic racism. But we've shown something crucial, that when we stand together, when we refuse to be silent, change is possible. Michelle joined him at the podium, their hands clasped. The Justice Fund has already helped 30 families get legal representation. We've supported 5 whistleblowers in coming forward. And we're just getting started. Sarah stepped forward to share the latest development. The state legislature has just announced the Carter-Thompson Act, requiring transparent investigation of all police misconduct cases and preventing problem officers from simply transferring to new departments. The room erupted in applause, but Elijah raised his hand for quiet. Don't celebrate yet. Laws can be passed and ignored. Policies can be changed and circumvented. Real change only happens when we stay vigilant, when we keep fighting, when we remember that justice isn't a destination, it's a constant struggle. Marcus stood up, showing everyone his scars. But now we fight together. Not just black and white, not just victims and allies, but everyone who believes in justice. Even good cops who want to serve with honor. The meeting ended with planning sessions for future actions. As people filed out, Elijah noticed a young black boy, maybe 7 years old, looking up at him. "My mom says you made the police behave," the boy said. Elijah knelt down to the child's level. "No, son. We all did it together. And someday, it'll be your turn to stand up for what's right." As they left the community center that night, the city felt different. Not perfect, not fixed, but changing. The streetlights illuminated faces full of determination rather than fear. It wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the long fight for justice.